Last week, you heard Ravi say that human beings have to be defined in terms of their essential worth in order for evil to be defined as evil. Ravi also claimed in that lecture that one of the entailments of naturalism is that there is no objective moral law. So we're well poised now for a fuller treatment of morality. The topic of morality may be among the most difficult that we will consider. For some, discussions of the complexities of moral philosophy may be difficult to grasp. For others, wrestling with biblical passages about war or with the problem of evil may take a great emotional toll. We've therefore divided the topic of morality into 2 weeks. John Jarogi will begin this week by looking at the moral argument for God's existence. John argues that because objective moral values are real, God must exist.
John Jarogi, based here in Atlanta, Georgia, along with our North American apologists, actually hails from Kenya. He came to the United States years ago to study medicine. God had other plans for him. He was truly gripped with a passion for Christian apologetics, came and met with us, went on to do his graduate work at Talbot, and now is in the midst, actually, of his PhD in philosophy, particularly in ethics, at the University of Georgia. He is also the radio voice of our program in Africa. He and his wife, Leah, and their children live in Atlanta. John is a very careful thinker. He understands the disciplines very well with which he works, and when you're finished listening to him, you will know that he covers the terrain with a great deal of conscientiousness and understanding, with the goal to communicating the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You'll be informed by John.
In Romans chapter 8 and verse 29, the Apostle Paul tells us that God's goal for us is to be conformed to the image of God's Son. God wants us to be like Jesus. Much of what that means is that our character will be perfected. We will one day be able to measure up to God's perfect standard of goodness. We will be sinless. That is an incredibly lofty goal. God thinks very highly of us. That is why ethics, or morality, is so central to the Christian life. It is an indispensable part of the process of our spiritual growth. But morality is also vitally important and relevant to all of humanity, since we are all moral beings. Morality plays such a central role in our lives that there is hardly any field of study it does not touch. In science, for example, we implicitly trust that the findings of science are reported honestly and truthfully. Almost all of the problems we face as human beings have a moral or an ethical component to them. At a personal level, when things don't go as we planned, when someone is unfair to us, when we fail at something or when we fail other people, we feel sometimes quite strongly that those experiences ought not to be. And from a social standpoint, when the world's banking systems collapse or when events such as the terrorist attacks in the US on September 11, 2001 happen, we trace the problem to a breakdown in certain moral precepts. And in the religious realm, morality plays such a huge role, for example, when you're dealing with the problem of evil. When we suffer, we ask why God will allow that to happen to us, which is to ask why God would allow something to happen to us that is not in keeping with his good moral character. So questions of evil, pain, and suffering are at their very root moral or ethical questions. Goodness is something we all long for, though admittedly, we sometimes pursue it in the wrong way. And so we cannot escape the fact that we live in a morally saturated universe. Our world comes packaged with moral principles. It is not neutral about right and wrong. Even those who deny the objectivity of morality still try to account for morality from within a closed human system. In this session, we will examine the widely held view that morality gives us a powerful clue to the existence of God and to his perfect moral nature. We will see that we cannot make sense of the objectivity of morality without God. Now, it is not just those who believe in God who maintain that we cannot make sense of morality without God. Here, for example, is a quotation from a prominent ethicist, J.L. Mackie, who was also an atheist, and I quote, "Moral properties constitute so odd a cluster of properties and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. In other words, no moral facts in a world governed by material processes." Formally, the moral argument for God's existence can be stated as follows. Premise number 1. If moral values and duties are objectively real, then God exists. Premise number 2. Moral values and duties are objectively real. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. This is a deductive argument. In a deductive argument, the conclusion follows logically and necessarily from the premises. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true as well. So are the premises true? I believe they can be shown to be true, and that's what we try to do in this lecture. But before we offer some support for the premises, we need to define some important terms in this argument. And the first word that we need to define is the word objective. Something is objective if it does not depend on the opinions or beliefs one person or even many people might hold about it. Think of a particular object sitting out there all by itself, for example, a mountain. It is just there, regardless of what you and I think about it. The opposite of objective is subjective, which refers to what a particular subject or subjects think about something. Whether chocolate is a better flavor than strawberry, for example, is a subjective view. It depends on who you talk to. Now, to say that moral values and duties are objectively real is to say that they exist independently of people's opinions or beliefs about them. If something is right, it would be right even if everybody believed it was wrong. And if something is wrong, it is wrong even if everyone believes it is right. To use a very common example in ethics, if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in brainwashing or exterminating everyone who disagreed with them, so that all remaining human beings on the planet ended up believing that it was right to exterminate the Jews, the Nazis would still have been wrong. That is what it means to say that moral values are objectively real. We discover them. We do not invent them. On reflection, this is a position that we all hold as human beings. There are things we truly believe to be right or wrong, though we may sometimes disagree on some of them. For example, morally healthy individuals would all agree that torturing babies for fun is wrong, that the Nazi ideology we just talked about was evil, and even atheists regularly complain that the Crusades and the Inquisitions were morally wrong. We are all moral beings, and we all draw a line somewhere when it comes to moral issues. Now, the second set of terms we need to define are moral values and moral duties. What is the difference between moral values and moral duties? The phrase moral values refers to a general category of all that is good. The good is a very broad category that even includes the beautiful. So anything that is good falls in the category of moral values. Moral duties, on the other hand, refer to the class of moral values to which one is morally responsible or obligated. To repeat, moral values is a general category that refers to anything that is good, and moral duties refer to a category of the good to which we are obligated. Now, the important point is this. Just because a certain moral value is good, it does not follow that I am morally responsible for it. For example, being a medical doctor, a teacher, a scientist, or a fireman are all morally praiseworthy, but no one person is responsible for all of them. If you choose to become a doctor instead of becoming a fireman, for example, you have not done anything wrong. But by choosing to become a doctor, you assume certain moral duties that do not apply to a fireman. When a patient is dying of a treatable disease, the doctor bears certain moral responsibilities towards the patient that are not true of the fireman. Or to give another example, it is a moral value to have every child on this planet fed and clothed. That includes my 2 boys. Now, I am responsible for making sure that my 2 boys are clothed and fed in a way that I am not responsible for every other child on the planet. I could not do that even if I wanted to, so it is not a duty for which I can be held accountable, as is the case with my 2 boys. So there is an objective realm of moral values, and we relate to it in our recognition of moral values and our moral duties. Let us now look at why it is commonly thought that this realm of moral values and duties depends on God for its existence. We would do this by offering some support for the premises of the moral argument for God's existence and responding to what I take to be the major objections raised against this argument. Remember, we stated the arguments as follows. 1. If moral values and duties are objectively real, then God exists. 2. Moral values and duties are objectively real. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Now, what reason do we have to think that the premises of this argument are true? Why, for example, should we assume that they claim that if moral values and duties are objectively real, then God exists? We have already said that to say that moral facts are objective is to say that they exist independently of people's opinions or beliefs about them. But there is a question here that you need to watch out for. How can we prove that moral facts are real? This is one of the most interesting questions in philosophy, and another reason why I strongly believe morality points to God. In one important sense, it is not possible to prove that moral facts are objectively real. Does that in any way weaken our argument? No, it does not. As philosophers have noted, there are many other things that we are rational to believe, and yet we cannot prove them. Take the external world, for example. It is not possible to prove that the external world exists. For all you know, this whole experience you're having right now could be fake. Your body could be in some lab somewhere, and you may be in a matrix setting, inhabiting a virtual reality. There is no way to prove that this is not happening. As the ancient Chinese philosopher put it, if when I am asleep, I am a man dreaming I am a butterfly, how do I know when I'm awake that I am not a butterfly dreaming I'm a man? We just know. We cannot prove it. This is true of many of our beliefs. It is true of metaphysical beliefs. For example, the belief that we all hold that the world was not created 5 minutes ago with all the memories we have. That there are other minds other than your own. Other people you meet could be cleverly constructed robots. We can't prove that they are not. Our apprehension of the laws of logic and mathematics is another good example. We just understand and use them. We cannot prove them. To try to use logic to prove logic would be to argue in a circle. There is no way to prove that any of these beliefs are true, yet we are rational in believing them. Proof works mainly in mathematics, so don't let anyone push you into a corner trying to get you to offer proof for the objectivity of morality. Any proof you succeed in producing will be weaker than the self-evident nature of morality. We apprehend the moral realm in the same way that we apprehend the external world. Anyone who does not believe in the reality of morality really needs help, not refutation. But if there is this realm of morality, and we all know this to be true, why do we take the extra step of saying that we need God to account for it? Remember the statement I quoted above from J.L. Mackie? He says that moral facts constitute such an odd cluster of properties that we cannot account for them without God. The reason Mackie made such a statement was because he was an atheist, and as an atheist, he was committed to a certain way of looking at the world, as is common with many other atheists. The most common form of atheism is the view that all of reality can be explained by material particles interacting with each other according to scientific laws. If that is true, then it follows that morality as we normally understand it cannot fit into that arrangement. Moral facts, or right and wrong, are rules of behavior that cannot be explained in terms of the interactions of physical entities with each other. To put the point differently, moral facts are value judgments over and above physical facts. You cannot account for moral values and duties using the laws of science because the laws of science are limited to describing causal interactions among material particles. To talk about value is to take a vantage point above science in order to make judgments about science. Maybe an illustration here from Wittgenstein will help. Wittgenstein has been associated with many strange ideas in philosophy, including postmodernism and the concept of language games. But even he could not shake off the power of the transcendence of ethics. In an essay he wrote in 1929, well into his later postmodern thought, he argued that when we say that something is either right or wrong, we make a judgment of value that is over and above what we are describing. Values are not simply given, even in complete descriptions of events. He said that you could make two columns, for example. In one column, you could offer an exhaustive description of a murder, and on the other column, you offer a complete description of the falling of a stone. From a scientific standpoint, both descriptions would be equivalent. Nothing in the description of the murder would entail the conclusion that the murder ought not to have happened. To say whether or not the murder ought to have happened is to make an additional value judgment to our description of the event. Philosophers sometimes state this point as follows: you cannot get an ought from an is. Science can tell you all you want to know about various chemical reactions and physical processes, but it will not tell you whether or not those chemical reactions ought to take place in a moral sense of ought. As Professor John Lennox says, science will tell you that if you put cyanide in grandma's tea, it will kill her. But science will not tell you whether or not you ought to do so, especially if you want to lay your hands on her property. To put it yet another way, science is merely descriptive. It is not prescriptive. I hope you can see where all this is going. If you hold to the position that all of reality consists of material particles and their causal interactions, you rule out morality because moral facts are not part of the material processes. On the other hand, if you agree that judgments of value apply to the world, you have to give up the materialistic thesis and thereby open a door to the unseen world where God lives. We'll return to this view later when we look at objections to this argument. One of the objections we'll look at is this: what if someone is willing to give up strict materialism and just accept this moral realm as real? Good question, but we'll return to it shortly. Now, what we have seen so far is that there exists a moral realm that is independent of human opinions or beliefs. This moral realm cannot be accounted for on the basis of scientific laws. But before we move on, I now want to say something about moral duties. Much of what we have said so far applies to the good or to moral values. We have said that moral values are objectively real. What about moral duties? Moral duties refer to that sense of oughtness we just talked about. In the face of a momentous moral decision, anyone who is morally healthy feels quite strongly that he or she is compelled to act, to do something, or to refrain from doing something bad. This is how Martin Luther King Jr. put it in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 1964. I refuse to accept the idea that the aceness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. That sense of compulsion or eternal oughtness is what we are trying to get at. Where does it come from? The most common answer is that it simply comes from reason. It is just reasonable to act in a certain way and not another way. Now, it is true that reason plays an important role in our understanding of morality, but it is wrong to say that reason is all we need to account for moral obligation. Such an answer fails to capture the full nature of the compulsion or moral duty that Reverend King was talking about. Listen to how John Stuart Mill, a legend in moral theory, describes moral obligation or duty. We do not call anything wrong unless we mean to imply that a person ought to be punished in some way or other for doing it, if not by law, by the opinion of his fellow creatures, if not by opinion, by the reproaches of his own conscience. It is a part of the notion of duty in every one of its forms that a person may be rightfully compelled to fulfill it. Duty is a thing which may be exacted from a person as one exacts a debt. Unless we think that it might be exacted from him, we do not call it his duty. Did you catch what Mill is saying here? Duty is something you can be rightfully punished for neglecting. That is surely not the case with the deliverances of reason. If you reason that something would be right to do, it does not commit you to doing it. You may choose to do it if you want, but if you choose not to do it, you are merely irrational. This is how another prominent moral philosopher, Robert Adams, explains this. To the extent that I have done something morally wrong, I have something to feel guilty about. To the extent that I have done something irrational, I have merely something to feel silly about, and the latter is much less serious than the former. Reflecting on all this, atheist philosopher Kai Nielsen wrote, "We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that all really rational persons should not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason does not decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one. Reflection on it depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality." So it is not enough to say that it is reason that gives to us our moral duties. Reason is inadequate here. This sense of oughtness or duty in morality is such a powerful pointer to the existence of a moral being who is in charge of the universe that some philosophers have actually argued that we should deny that we have any moral duties if we think that God does not exist. Now, if your position on morality leads you to the conclusion that we have no moral duties, then so much the worse for your view. You have just reduced it to absurdity. We do have moral duties, and they make sense if God exists. We all know that we are moral beings at our very core, and we live with this sense of oughtness that is quite powerful within us. Judgments of value include a certain sense of compulsion. We ought to want to conform our lives to morality. Here's a second example also from Wittgenstein. He argues that many of the judgments we make, even from reason, are merely relative judgments of value, and they lack that compulsion component that characterizes moral duties. Here is his example. If I were to say that such and such is the right road to Grantchester, I merely mean it is the best way to take if you want to go to Grantchester. It is perhaps the quickest, most scenic, one with the least amount of traffic, and so on. But notice that the appeal of the judgment that the road is indeed the best one to take is conditioned on a predetermined end. The suggestion appeals to you only if you want to go to Grantchester. If you have no interest in going to Grantchester, then you don't care about the road. Not so with an absolute judgment of value. It is not devoid of sense, even if I don't want to change my behavior. We ought to want to change our behavior when ethical considerations enter the picture. So what have we seen so far? That there are objective moral facts that are over and above the physical reality that the hard sciences study. And two, these moral facts come to us in the form of imperatives or commands. This scenario makes sense if God exists. It makes no sense if God does not exist. Specifically, let me highlight again 3 serious problems an atheist would have in an attempt to account for this moral scenario. 1, he would have a problem explaining how moral facts could exist if everything is reduced to matter in motion. If he takes morality seriously, he's got one foot in the realm in which God, all minds, live, and that points to God. Secondly, he would have a problem accounting for moral duties. We have also talked about this. And finally, it would be very hard for an atheist to account for various aspects of human nature that make it possible for morality to apply to us. Here is what I mean by this last difficulty. By accounting for human nature, I am referring to the peculiar characteristics that human beings possess that are such a perfect fit for a moral life. These facts include the following: that human beings just happen to be the kinds of creatures that have immediate, unexplainable access to this objective moral realm. that human beings, as opposed to pigs or donkeys, have special value. They are created with a free will that allows them to choose whether or not to align their lives with this moral realm. And they have some controls built into them to guide them in the moral arena. Conscience, guilt, shame, praise, and blame, they all apply and play a role in helping us deal with a sense of oughtness. And morality applies directly to our well-being. When we live according to moral precepts, we flourish. All this makes sense if we were designed by a moral God to recognize moral values and duties and to live moral lives, but it makes no sense in an atheistic world. The nature of morality and our connection to it makes it very hard to hold a position in ethics, sometimes referred to as moral Platonism, the view that moral facts just exist inexplicably. This does not explain the features of our connection to morality that we just talked about. No. Moral facts exist for a reason, and the best explanation is that we were created by a moral being who cares about us. So if moral values and duties are objectively real, then God exists. And now, finally, we get to premise number 2. Moral values and duties are objectively real. We have already said much that applies to this second premise. I will not repeat points I've already made. Instead, what I'd like to do here is to clarify some common misconceptions about the nature of objective moral values and duties and respond to some objections to the argument as a whole. I can guarantee you that if you say to your unbelieving friends that morality points us to God, you will get at least some of these objections thrown at you. Objection number 1. Are you saying that people who believe in God are more moral than those who do not? The answer to this question is absolutely not. As William Lane Craig has emphasized in his debates with leading atheists, the claim is not that we need to believe in God in order to recognize moral facts and to order our lives according to these facts. Far from denying that non-believers can recognize morality and order their lives accordingly, the Bible says that Gentiles, in context unbelievers, who do not have the law, do by nature the things written in the law because the moral law is written on their heart. That's in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. I have atheist friends, and maybe you do as well, who live quite exemplary moral lives, sometimes even better than some of my Christian friends. All human beings are moral beings. Jesus did not come to proclaim a moral revolution. He came to revive spiritually dead people and to welcome them into the kingdom of God. What the Bible offers is salvation because we are all spiritually dead and we all fall short of what we know to be right. We all stand in need of forgiveness. So the question is not whether belief in God is necessary for morality. It is whether God himself is necessary for morality. Here's the second objection, and it has to do with evolution. And sometimes it goes like this. Hasn't evolution taught us all we need to know about morality? Now, it is very important that you get your non-believing friends to clarify exactly what they mean when they appeal to evolution to explain morality. If they mean to say that morality developed among humans because it was helpful for our survival, then you need to point out that what they are really saying is that morality is not objective. We could have developed a different system of morality as long as it helped us survive. Rape, killing the weaker members of our species, etc., are all viable options. Behaviors that we condemn today are not really objectively wrong. They are just socially unacceptable. There is nothing really wrong with rape or torturing babies for fun. As Charles Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can be hardly a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. But many, actually most atheists, don't believe this. They believe that morality is objective. What we are trying to show them is that they cannot affirm the objectivity of morality and reject God at the same time. But there is something else they could mean when they appeal to evolution. They could be saying that morality is hardwired into us, that we can and do find certain parts of the brain, for example, associated with morality. If this is the claim that is being made, then you don't have to argue with it. You can agree that it is an open question as to how we learn about morality. Maybe it is hardwired into our DNA. Maybe we learn it from the society around us. This is an interesting epistemological question. It is a question of how we come to know or how we learn about morality. But our original question was about the foundation of morality. It was a metaphysical question, not an epistemological or knowledge question. The third objection that I want us to talk about is moral relativism. Roughly, this is the claim that what is right or wrong depends either on an individual or on a community. The first thing to note here is that such a claim supports premise 1, for it now follows that there is no such thing as objective morality, and all the problems seen so far arise all over again if we deny the objectivity of morality. But moral relativism has many problems of its own. Does anyone really believe that nothing is either right or wrong? That right and wrong are just a matter of opinion? Usually, people say this with regard to things they don't care too much about, or regarding areas in their lives in which they don't want too much scrutiny. But all you have to do to see them change their position in an instant is to take something they value and treat it as if it were relative. No one is a moral relativist when it comes to what we really care about. The reality of morality comes into clear focus when we come face to face with the problem of evil. We feel quite strongly that certain things ought not to be. The problem of evil is often cited as the number one obstacle to faith in God. When you think about it, the problem of evil confirms the objectivity of morality in a powerful way. When we complain about evil, we are appealing to an absolute moral standard, to a standard of good. We are saying that this standard of goodness has been violated where it ought not to have been violated. But that is to affirm the objectivity of morality. The moral relativist loses the right to complain about evil. That is why Rabbi Zechariah says the following: when you say there is such a thing as evil, you assume there is such a thing as good. And when you assume that there is such a thing as good and evil, you assume a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between the two. And when you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral law giver. And finally, we now consider an objection against grounding morality in God that has proven to be quite durable. And this objection is referred to as the Euthyphro dilemma. It gets its name from a character in one of Plato's dialogues called the Euthyphro. It is usually raised in the form of a question: does God command the good because it is good, or is the good good because God commands it? Now that might sound like a meaningless tongue twister, but it's a real problem and a very good question. Let me try to explain it a little bit. The question is this: is there a standard of goodness that God points to and recommends to us? Or does God himself just decide that certain things are good and other things are bad? Here's the dilemma. If God appeals to a certain standard of goodness, then that standard exists independently of God, and even God is subservient to it. So morality does not depend on God after all. On the other hand, if God just decides that certain behaviors are right and others are wrong, then morality is arbitrary because it is whatever God says it is. To repeat, if the first option is correct, if there is a standard of goodness that exists independently of God, then morality is not grounded in God. But if the second option is right, if God just decides that certain things are right and other things are wrong, then morality is arbitrary. God could, for example, decide that rape, stealing, murder are all good, and mercy, justice, love, etc. are vices, and then we'd have to accept that. But that is a crazy view of morality. So either way, appealing to God does not help us in our moral quest, or the argument goes. So how do we respond to the Euthyphro dilemma? The correct response is to reject both horns of the dilemma. It is a false dilemma from a Christian perspective. Remember that discussion Jesus had with the rich young man in Mark chapter 10? When the young man called Jesus good teacher, what was Jesus' response? He said, "No one is good except God alone." What Jesus was saying is that goodness is part of the very essence of God. Elsewhere, Jesus said that our Heavenly Father is perfect. So from a Christian standpoint, we don't have to choose between a standard external to God or the possibility of some crazy moral commands issued arbitrarily by God. God Himself is the essence of goodness, and He is therefore the standard of goodness. He does not appeal to a standard outside Himself to know what is good, and when He issues commands, the commands flow from His good and loving nature, so that they are not arbitrary and they cannot be evil, because God Himself is good. So we have very good reasons to think that our argument for God's existence rests on solid ground. Here is the argument one more time. Premise 1. If moral values and duties are objectively real, then God exists. Second premise. Moral values and duties are objectively real. Conclusion. Therefore, God exists. If all we have said is more reasonable than its denial, then it follows that our conclusion is also true. God exists, and He is the explanation for morality.